After nearly 2.5 years of military campaign in Yemen, the Saudi-led coalition is no closer to achieving its objective. That's according to a new confidential United Nations report. So is there an end in sight to this conflict, and what's being done to stop it? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashim Ahalbarra. A confidential United Nations report suggests the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen is failing. For nearly 2.5 years, Saudi Arabia and its partners have been carrying out airstrikes against the Houthi rebels in one of the world's poorest countries. But despite the coalition's considerable military power, it's no closer to victory. The report says the campaign has led to further fragmentation of Yemen's political landscape, and the country is suffering from one of the largest humanitarian crises in the region. The war has killed more than 10,000 people, and it's to blame for widespread famine and the worst cholera outbreak anywhere in the world. The panel behind the United Nations report says the Saudi-led coalition's air campaign has had little operational or tactical impact on the ground. It accuses all parties of continuing to violate international human rights laws, saying government forces, Houthi rebels, fighters loyal to former President Ali Abdullah Saleh, and the United Arab Emirates are detaining people illegally. The UN report also accuses the Saudi-led coalition of preventing journalists and some aid agencies access to Sana'a, and that Yemen has become what it calls a breeding ground for armed groups like ISIL and Al-Qaeda. Let's bring in our panel. In Istanbul, Bill Van Isveld, who represents Human Rights Watch. And in London, Afzal Ashraf, Associate Professor at the Centre for Conflict Security and Terrorism at Nottingham University. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Let me start by asking Mr. Esveld this. Mr. Esveld, this is a report which has been conducted by a panel of experts that seems to be portraying a grim reality in Yemen, a country devastated by war and where millions face famine. Are we talking about what could potentially become one of the worst humanitarian crises the region is witnessing?
I think we're already talking about one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. If you look at different particular aspects of the disaster in Yemen, which is very much a man-made disaster. The cholera epidemic there is already the worst in the world. You have a country where something like 80 to 90% of civilian goods were imported before the conflict, and there's now a drastic reduction in imports of needed basic goods, including medical supplies and things like fuel and food, which has unsurprisingly led to enormous levels of acute malnutrition. My own focus is working on children's rights in the region, and we know that there are hundreds of thousands of children already who are severely malnourished, and just a little bit of a push over the edge could push them to the brink of death, out of almost 2 million who are acutely malnourished. So the situation is already disastrous, including for Yemen's most vulnerable people, its children.
Very sad reality indeed. Mr. Ashraf, who to blame for this situation in particular?
Everybody's to blame except the innocent victims. The coalition that is fighting this war simply for regime change has to ask itself, whatever the rights and wrongs of regime change, is it worth the disaster that we're facing, the misery? I think you talked about the size of this problem. Yes, it could be, and I think it is definitely the worst humanitarian man-made disaster, but I think it also is going to be distinctive in that it is the worst disaster that has been ignored. Over a year ago, the UN published a report saying that 80% of Yemen's population was in need of humanitarian humanitarian assistance. and that has not been addressed. So unsurprisingly, this draft report, and it is a draft report as far as I know, it's not been released, is only underestimating the extent of the human misery that's been caused simply because people on all sides of the conflict are willing to make innocence the collateral for their political differences.
Mr. Asfel, there's been some repeated calls by the international community, the United Nations in particular, for the Saudi-led coalition to allow access to the airport of Sana'a, Al-Makha, the other seaports, to be able to deliver aid to those who are affected. Do you think that is something that could eventually happen anytime soon?
Well, it should happen. There's no reason that it isn't happening. There's no military justification for it, and the amount of suffering that's caused by these closures is enormous. You know, the Ministry of Health in Yemen has estimated that something like 10,000 people have died because they needed urgent medical care abroad and couldn't leave. I don't know the number of people who've died because they couldn't leave the Sana'a airport for medical care abroad, but we know that something like 7,000 people a year left for urgently needed medical treatment abroad from that airport before the conflict began. As I mentioned, the vast majority of what Yemenis depended on to live was imported, and you know, we know that there are some severe delays of imports, and some ships carrying humanitarian goods have been turned around or forced to dock at other ports rather than the ports on the Red Sea where their supplies are most needed. These are things that could be turned around in an instant, and that's not happening.
Mr. Ashraf, why nothing has been done by the international community to stop this from happening, or to put an end to the sufferings of the millions of Yemenis?
Yes, they are. And as I said, you know, what we're talking about isn't something that's just becoming obvious now. It's been an unacceptably high level of human suffering for over a year, if not 2 years. What I think is the reason for a lack of response from the international community is that, as you've said, the main protagonists have a great deal of influence. They buy influence through the amount of money that they have in the UN and elsewhere. And countries such as the US and the UK, who are influential in the international community, have an interest in terms of weapon sales. So what we have seen is that UK is one of the largest suppliers of weapons to Saudi Arabia, and even though people in the UK have tried to get legal measures to stop the UK from supplying Saudi with weapons, they have failed. In the US, President Trump, in his recent visit to Saudi Arabia, increased or celebrated the new contracts that the US is signing with Saudi. So there is an unfortunate incentive for very many members of the international community who have influence for commercial and economic reasons to perpetuate this ghastly and totally unnecessary conflict.
We're now being joined by Mr. Hakim Al-Masmari, who is the editor of the Yemen Post from the Yemeni capital, Sana'a. Mr. Hakim, what's the general sentiment among Yemenis about this humanitarian disaster? Who they blame for what's happening to them?
The world. No one expected the world to remain silent for 2 years of bloodshed, 2 years that witnessed tens of thousands of airstrikes, 2 years that killed over 10,000 civilians by coalition-led airstrikes, 2 years, not forget the war, 2 years that they have been more killed from the siege on Yemen than those who were killed by the war. And the world is silent. This is what happens when major international interests are in place. This is what happens when big financial stakes are in place, and Yemen is paying the price. This only hurts the credibility of the international community and of the UN, because why have they not been able to talk earlier or stop this bloodshed? Even when hope comes for the Yemeni people, every time they feel hope, there's always a backlash and more bloodshed. And sadly, those who are killed or who pay the price are the civilians.
Let's move on a little bit, because there are different aspects of this report that has been issued by the panel of experts. Mr. Esveld, the report also talks about different actors with different agendas, funding different proxy forces for different political reasons. Are you just concerned that this could potentially drag the conflict on and on, which might leave just thousands and millions of people facing the risk of more starvation and death?
Well, look, I haven't read the report, but according to the reporting about it by Foreign Policy and others, its conclusions don't really sound very surprising, including the conclusions about the number of proxy forces that are being supported, the fragmentation of the political sphere, and so on. And unfortunately, given the way things have happened so far, which have been characterized by absolute impunity, a total failure of accountability for abuses, the greater the fragmentation, unfortunately it seems likely that civilians again are going to continue to pay the price. I mean, some of the groups that I understand are spoken about in the report are the UAE-backed forces operating in Yemen. The United States has worked very closely and vocally praised those forces. The former acting director of the CIA called them a model partner in counterterrorism. And yet we know my own organization, Human Rights Watch, has documented disappearances, torture of dozens of people by those forces, including 4 children. And it's really unsurprising that we've reached a military sort of stalemate when the laws of war are consistently flouted. I mean, if you are going around and routinely violating the laws of war, disappearing young men, you're creating a huge number of angry families, desperate relatives who are launching protests on an almost weekly basis to figure out basic information about whether their loved ones are still alive. Mm-hmm. This is not the way to win hearts and minds. This is also in grave violation of basic norms. And
speaking of winning the hearts and minds
from the UAE, none pushed by the Saudi forces either.
Speaking of winning the hearts and minds of Yemenis, Mr. Ashraf, the United States of America, the UK, different countries are providing significant military assistance, intelligence, cooperation with Saudi-led coalition. However, the 2 key players in the Saudi-led coalition, United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, seem to be really driving 2 different agendas here. The UAE providing significant assistance to the pro-separatist movement in the south. Saudi Arabia backs different groups, some of them loyal to the President Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi, and this is just creating further political divide in the country. How do you see this whole ambiguity from both key players?
This ambiguity, as you put it, this disunity is very characteristic of Middle Eastern conflicts. Never since the 1940s have the Gulf states or the Arab states ever been able to hold together a coalition politically or militarily. Whenever they put together a coalition, it fragments. This is almost an empirical fact. The previous speaker spoke about the legal ethical issues. I think he made those points very well. But militarily, we need to look at it from the basis of what is effective. So any coalition involving Arab states has a history of failure. It's almost a guarantee that they will fight different sides. But also this idea of arming non-state proxies to effect regime change, which the US and Western countries developed and are in some ways backing, is one that is also a failing idea. The ethical issues aside, there hasn't been an example except for one in the last 30 years where regime change by force has been successful. The exception was Milosevic in Serbia, but there were particular reasons for that.
Okay.
But every single other regime change has failed and has caused more trouble security-wise, militarily, than it started off with.
Let's include Mr. Al-Masmari in Sana'a. Mr. Al-Masmari, you remember 2015 when Saudi Arabia launched its military campaign. They came with a statement saying basically the reason why they are intervening is to restore the government of the Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi and to prevent a descent into chaos. But when you look at the situation right now, is more chaos than ever. What people are saying now about this whole campaign against Yemen?
It's very hard to imagine here, especially in those areas that are in control right now by the Saudi-led coalition. For example, in the south of Yemen, where the Saudi-led coalition is in control, in Aden, as example. Over the last year, the Emirates have been in control of Aden, even more in control than the president himself, President Abdullah Hadi. They have caused a lot of friction and tension and problems, which gives those who are in Aden less hope. They were against the Houthis. They hated the Houthis and the ex-President Saleh, and they were hoping that when the UAE forces and Saudi forces come, they will see light. That did not happen. And suddenly, from last week, there's been dramatic changes where the UAE forces have been evacuating and new Saudi forces are happening. So it's a shift. This month is seeing major shifts in Sana'a and in Aden, where both sides. In Aden, where Saudi-led ally Saudi is getting more the upper hand on the UAE forces. And in Sana'a, we expect next week Sana'a to witness the biggest protest in the history, where the ex-President Saleh will take lead politically, or will take the political negotiations away from the hands of the Houthis. This will not be easy. It will cause a lot of problems, a lot of friction. So this month we'll see dramatic changes, which will result in new ways of dialogue, new powers or new influences in how to stop this war.
Mr. Esfeld, against the backdrop of what Masmari was talking about, which is basically the fragmentation, the different political affiliations, the different acting player, isn't it something which is becoming extremely difficult for you to track down the violations of human rights, those responsible for those violations? Because each time you try to pinpoint at a particular instance, then you've been told, you know what, we're not responsible. It might be the responsibility of other groups operating on the ground.
Yeah, the denials of responsibility for the horrible things that we're seeing have become routine, and they've become routine because there's no price to be paid for such denials. And indeed, as was recently the case with BBC journalists who were not permitted to enter the country, independent human rights monitors have also been barred from entry, or at least not allowed to enter the Houthi-controlled areas on UN flights. So my own colleagues are unable to get into the country, and when we do report on violations, the response is personal attacks against my colleagues, leaking their passports online, things like this. It's also been a consistent policy to try and shut down the United Nations when it tries to report and hold the Saudi-led coalition to a minimum degree of responsibility for grave violations against children. You may remember that last year the United Nations was about to include, well, that did include the Saudi-led coalition on a list, the so-called list of shame, of armed groups and governments around the world that cause grave violations against children. You know, they were responsible for killing about 80% of around 800 children whose deaths were verified last year, you know, bombing dozens of schools. And the response was not to say, okay, yes, we have made mistakes, we need to hold people responsible, we need to never repeat these mistakes for the future of the country. Instead, the response was, we, Saudi Arabia, are going to cut all of our funding to the UN unless you take us off that list. And you know, that's the response was that they were removed from the list under enormous pressure. We can't see that sort of thing continuing to happen and expect that civilians are not going to continue to suffer.
Mr. Ashraf, the narrative that has been sold to the world in 2015, which is basically to try to save a country from the brink of collapse, has turned into an ugly reality on the ground. Proxy forces, countries running detention centers. It's war at every different battlefield. Do you have any concerns that Yemen could further implode if this doesn't come to an end?
Yemen, I think, to a large extent, has imploded. When you've got 80% plus of the population suffering, I can't see that you can describe it any more than that as a breakdown in society. You've had a very eloquent description of the human rights abuses, the humanitarian abuses. So Yemen, as a country, will take years to come back into a form of stability. And this is why it is so important for the leaderships in countries such as Saudi Arabia and Europe and the US to look at this afresh in terms of the medium and long term, because this conflict has the ability to spill over, not physically, but also ideologically. The narrative of the extremists that none of us supports is that the Arab governments are under the yoke of Western nations, and they are killing their own people on their behalf. And so what you have here, as we now approach the Hajj and Eid, the spirit of sacrifice, is that people are being sacrificed in favor of political disputes that are centered around
you have also the sectarian divide which has been playing out. You have different regional issues. Mr. Al-Masmari, is there any real chance or hope that Yemenis could set aside their differences, key player pull out from the country, and a political solution be implemented?
We are seeing hope. Honestly speaking, this month, I'm very optimistic with all these changes. There are problems that are being solved. A major issue for the Saudi-led coalition was the UAE forces were not cooperating with many of the southern forces. A big issue in the north was that the Houthis were too aggressive and they needed a political voice. That will change when the ex-president's party comes in full control or on the front seat, driver's seat. So these changes are optimistic, Hashim, and I feel that the end is not near, but the end is nearer than where it was before. The problem is Yemen is not facing only a war between Saudi coalition and the Houthis. Yemen is facing a war, a hunger war, an epidemic war, a humanitarian crisis. It's unbearable what these civilians are facing, and no one is looking at them, or even those who the Yemenis thought would be passionate towards them are not. So these changes that are happening over the last month, I feel are optimistic, and I do expect a major transformation on Thursday when the party of the ex-president announces their own initiative for the Yemeni solution, which will go very close to what the UN has proposed and planned. And that started
Hakim, I would like to ask you one final question, since you live in Sana'a. Do you believe that after all what's been happening for the last 2 years and a half, that Saleh, the Houthis, the Islah Party, the secessionists of the South could turn the chapter of what's been going on and build a new nation?
I'll be honest, Hashim. I'll be honest with you. These sides are trying to negotiate secretly between themselves, trying to open doors of mediation. This was not the case last year or just months ago. But for the last couple of months, you witness a lot of pressure or a lot of pushing from all the sides, the Houthis, the ex-president's party, and the Islah Party, all of them trying to open doors of communication, or in other words, trying to create the post-war links or post-war political issues instead of military issues. So there are a lot of optimistic things, but it will take time. Will the U.S. force the Saudis to stop? Will the U.S., the Saudis and the UAE agree on how to solve the South issue? Will the Houthis and the Saleh Party agree? So it's complicating, but it's very optimistic right now.
Very complicated indeed. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to all our guests, Hakim Al-Masmari, Bill Vanisveld, and Afzal Ashraf. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashim Al-Barra, and the whole team here, bye for now.